Americans love to read, and it's evident here at BookCon, where fans have packed the Javits Center, checking out the latest books and also hoping to meet their favorite authors. But what impact does representation and diversity have on the books we read?
I make books or I make art that is always starting from a personal space that has political and social implications. I'm trying to touch on sensitive issues from a place that will make people reconsider their preconceptions.
When I write a book, I am thinking about the child that I was. I'm thinking about some of the children that I meet who don't feel heard or seen.
Girls of color need to see themselves reflected in books and in movies and in stories, just like anybody else needs to see themselves reflected. Otherwise, they'll feel invisible and angry.
According to the Annual Review of Sociology, the boundaries between racial and ethnic groups are becoming blurred by high rates of intermarriage and the growing number of persons with mixed ancestry. 60% of the books published in 2015 about people of color were created by people from outside of those cultures. We'll look at a movement to inject more diversity into publishing by 3 authors and a discussion from an interracial family on books that feature characters of color.
So this is the image of the census, and the caption that goes with it reads, "Only since 2000 does the U.S. Census allow respondents to select more than one race to indicate their racial identity." So they added this mark one or more races, that before you had to only indicate one race to decide if you are white or black or American Indian or Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, other Asian, Native Hawaiian, Gomayan or Chamorro, Samoan, other Pacific Islander, but you only had to choose one. So only since 2000, people can belong to more than one race. My name is Yael Ben-Zion. I'm an artist and working with lens-based media mostly. My book is called Intermarriage, and it's about the issue of intermarriage, why people choose to marry someone that is not from their own social group, and what are the challenges that they face and their experience. Usually a lot of this project starts with my own life, with my own personal life. So they are a reflection of me, but instead of having it as a self-portraiture, I try to use my experience in order to see how I can expand it and how other people experience things that are similar or parallel to my experience. My previous books didn't touch directly on the subject of interfaith or interracial marriage. And the idea came from a campaign of the State of Israel that was targeting Jews that were intermarried. It may sound a bit shocking, but in Israel, given the fact that according to the law within Israel, you can only marry someone from your own religion, and there is a fear, given the history of the State of Israel and where it's going, there is a serious fear of the word that they use is assimilation. So the Jewish people will disappear because people will intermarry. So the campaign that I saw was aimed at Jewish people outside of Israel that were supposedly lost because they intermarried. I wanted people to ask themselves what's the difference, if any, and specifically with regard to the Jewish community, because this is where I'm coming from. I'm aware of a lot of very liberal Jewish people that would say, I don't see any problem with interracial marriages. You can be a white person marry a black person, or you can be an Asian person marry someone else. But I do see a problem with a Jew marry a non-Jew. I thought that it can be interesting for everyone, but one thing that it was important to me, and I think it actually made the book more complicated and less sellable or less easily digested, is that I juxtaposed interfaith and interracial couples. I included some documents in the book in order to put it within a historical reference. So the few items that I use is one excerpt from the lower court decision in the case of Loving versus Virginia. He stated in an opinion that Almighty God created the races white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and He placed them on separate continents. And, but for the interference with His arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriage. The fact that He separated the races shows that He did not intend for the races to mix. So that's a quote of the Supreme Court of the trial judge in Virginia. He has like this all sort of description, and God intended them to be separate. And the fact that they end up on the same continent, that's almost like a mistake. But so the religious excuse of why interracial marriages are illegal. What was important to me in the book was not to define intermarriage, but to talk about the implications of intermarriage in a society that has problems to accept it. I've been working with a publisher that I worked with before, so I didn't try to see if other people will sell it. For them, it was never an issue, and they just ran with it. I think they thought that it may be a topic that will actually gouge interest from different audiences, which it did. The way the book is designed, it was really important to me that first you look at the image. So the image is usually the thing that catches most of the page. And then you actually look at the title that is a bit under the image. And then you look at the text. It was very, very important to me regarding that's the question of representation, not to talk in the names of the people that I photograph, and to respect their privacy and to respect how they want to represent themselves. So I think images can bring you to different places, and that's the power. That's the power of visual art. It's a very complicated world, and we need to tackle it, and I'm trying to do it through my art.
I think when I set out to write in the beginning, my intended readers were the people who were asking me, "What are you?" consistently and tirelessly. That I felt like the only answer that satisfied that question for them was, well, I have a black parent and I have a white parent, which is a really kind of screwed up non-answer if you think about it. That's like the least thing you know about me, really. It tells you what my parents look like or how they identify, but it tells you nothing about myself. And so I wanted to answer that question seriously, and it took like a book-length answer to get it right. My first book is called The Professor's Daughter, and I would describe it as a father-daughter story. In reality, my father helped start the field of Black studies, right? He came of age as a scholar and a historian in the late 60s during the Black Power movement that recognized a need for and a complete lack of representation of Black history. So in my book, you have a character like that who has a daughter who looks like me. And one of the events that precipitates the book is that there's this accident and the girl's brother dies and the parents divorce. And so she's left kind of alone and bereft to navigate her racial identity and her identity in general after her family has blown apart. I felt like I was writing against a stereotype, the tragic mulatto, which is really a myth that evolved from a 19th century canon of literature that saw typically the tragic mulatto as a biracial person with a black parent and a white parent, but who could pass for white. And those characters are always described as being like mentally imbalanced or problematic. And we see that in films like Imitation of Life, the 1934 version, the 1959 version, which come from a book. We see that in Showboat. We see that in Clotel. And in a slightly different form, we see that in Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, where you have individuals who trade their black solidarity for white privilege at the cost of conscience. A lot of the writers and figures we think of as being central to describing the black experience have a white parent or are mixed. Booker T. Washington had a white parent. Frederick Douglass had a white parent. Other people that we think of as being central to describing this experience are mixed, very legibly so. So have you seen W.E.B. Du Bois, what he looks like? Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. You know, figures who founded the NAACP are often biracial or mixed people. I think central to the black experience we have always had, and also not only central to the canon of black literature, but central to black experience, we have always had a very mixed community. I could theorize that maybe one reason why there are a lot of biracial or mixed black people who are writing about the black experience is because historically they might have had more white privilege to enter into spaces to become educated or have access to avenues that would allow them to be published. I wrote another book called Searching for Zion, The Quest for Home in the African Diaspora. It follows on the heels of my father's scholarship, which is in African American religion. He has a book called Slave Religion, in which he describes Christianity as a driving force of identity for enslaved people when they started to become American, insofar as the book of Exodus invited them to imagine that there might be a promised land for themselves. I began to want to pursue people who were still motivated by that story. So I started traveling around the globe finding Black utopian communities who had left the United States or places in the West out of feelings of displacement and disenfranchisement, and looking to create the promised land or discover the promised land elsewhere. I too felt, as a mixed race individual and a light-skinned Black woman, feelings of uneasiness with home, or not always feeling at home, especially in a nation that remains so stratified along racial lines. My father, as I was doing the journeying for Searching for Zion, which took me to a lot of other nations, including Jamaica, to learn more about the Rastafari faith, he told me, you know, you're going about looking for Zion the wrong way. It's really not a place. It's an ideal striving for freedom, which is a lived experience. And it's a gesture that we should be making, constantly striving for. It's not really a place you've arrived at and are settled in, but rather an ideal that we're trying to live out. I see my role as a professor at City College to be part of dismantling the problem of there not being enough representation by identifying writers of color. Most of my students are people of color. And when I identify a writer with talent, then I feel it's my mission to help them get published.
The world doesn't need more books, right? It needs more good books. And sometimes it takes some time for you to cook your good book.
I think the question of where do I fit in, where do I belong, what is my identity, where's my place in the world, those sorts of questions are a young person's questions. The questions of a mature person about one's place in the world, I think, if one is maturing properly, have to do with what can I do to serve my community? What should my role be in my community to help other people less fortunate than myself? How can I make my community more representative or reflective, more free, not only for myself, but for everybody within it?
I love writing for children. Children's books were just a big part of my life. They were so important to me in childhood. I moved a lot as a child and was in a lot of different schools for every grade. And books were sort of my anchor and the thing that helped me have a home no matter where I was. When I was growing up, I saw myself reflected in some children's books by Julius Lester, by Eloise Greenfield, Camille Yarbrough, Walter Dean Myers. But I think that there weren't a lot of opportunities for Black authors in children's publishing. I very often saw a lot of poor representation of Black children, Black people in books. Growing up, I still see a lot of poor representation in books. And I think that sometimes that comes from a place of ignorance. Sometimes it just comes from maybe a lack of experience with actual Black people. I think that the children's book industry needs more writers of color, it needs more illustrators of color, it needs children's book professionals of color, behind the scenes, editors, school and library people, marketing and sales people. When I write a book, I am thinking about, I think, the child that I was. I'm thinking about some of the children that I meet who don't feel heard or seen. It's really important to me to represent Black and brown children on the page. I think that children start talking about race at a very early age. I've worked with children as young as 2 who, whether or not their parents or the adults around them knew it, they were definitely aware of race and talking about race. I think that, especially in this country and in this culture, race and issues around race are at the foundation of everything that happens. I don't think that there's an age limit or any time that discussion of race is inappropriate. So as a person who had a Jamaican mother and my father is Nigerian, and we also spent time in both of those countries. We spent time in Kenya, we spent time here in the United States, we spent time in Europe. I had the benefit of being around a lot of different cultures and having varied experiences. I think that because of my own experiences growing up and my life now, my work always includes what has a little bit of an international or global perspective, sometimes literally by the characters either being immigrants or being children of immigrants. I write pretty much about New York City and just about how children can, within a few blocks, encounter different cultures and encounter people of different ethnicities and different backgrounds and have that be a normal part of their lives. I think that the children's publishing industry is becoming more and more aware of the fact that this is a multiracial, multi-ethnic nation and that all voices need to be heard. I write about girls and boys of color. My first book, 8th Grade Super Zero, was about a young boy, an 8th grader. I think that there are a variety of people of color writing for children of color, and I think that what's important to me is that we are all able to write about the variety of experiences that children of color have. There's no one Black experience. For instance, in Naomi's 2, the most recent Naomi story, my goal in that was to really sort of reflect some of the experiences of Black girls who feel like microaggressions and little things that happen to them every day are ignored, or they're told are not very important. And so that was really important to me to show that how those can affect you, how kids are thinking about these things from very young ages. I think a lot of times adults think that kids are not thinking about a lot of these issues or not really engaging with them, and that's just not true.
In 2016, books written or illustrated by and about people of color made up 22% of children's books in the U.S.
Hi, I'm Frank.
Hi, I'm Kara. These are our daughters, Thea, age 4, and Zadie, age 8.
I think having biracial representation in books is very important for kids. It's important that they see themselves in books. I think the end goal is to make voracious readers, having characters that look like them, characters that are experience the same things that they experience and maybe have families that look like their families, I think will draw them more into the stories.
From the time Zadie was born till Thea was born 4 years later, there are definitely more books about, biracial characters. I think what's really notable in those is that many of the books just have biracial characters but aren't about being biracial, whereas 4 years ago, most of the books that featured biracial characters, were about being biracial.
There seems to be an awareness of mixed race and biracialness culturally, more so in the last 5 years, I think.
We were really lucky because Frank's mother is an educator and really went out of her way as soon as Zadie was born to find books that featured biracial characters.
My family is very aware and very cognizant of the books that they purchase for the girls, and oftentimes they will feature people of color or children that are biracial and things like that.
My parents aren't that technological, tech savvy, and I think that if they come across a book with a little biracial girl, particularly even, just a little girl with curly hair, because that's sort of, I think, a big thing in our house, is if you have curly hair, straight hair, they will definitely get it, but they don't know how to seek it out. Because there aren't as many books featuring biracial characters out there, it's hard to just randomly pick one up.
When I read books with characters that are a lot like me, I feel like it's like real because it just feels like more like me and I feel like it's actually happening. Sometimes at bedtime we pick a story. I'm reading Gabby. It's about this Black girl that makes perfect beads for her hair and gets her hair braided. And I like that story, and I feel like I can do things that she can do as well. Like, she invented a new kind of barrette, and she looks a lot like me and does things that I like to do. Because she has her hair braided. There's another book called I'm Mixed. I just like it because it has a lot in common with me, and it kind of just like teaches me about like what really makes me mixed.
Seeing families like ours in children's books makes me hopeful for the future, that maybe we're entering a time when everything isn't just black and white. It's also just really important to have more people of color, even if they're not biracial, that are represented in children's books that you can pick up in a library or in a store.
When I read books that are a lot like me and I think of the world, I think of like all the other kids that are mixed like me, that have curly hair, that could be thinking the same thing as me. Maybe the things in the book that you see are things that you can actually do. I feel like that's another way of reaching out to other people and knowing that you're like not the only one in the world who's mixed.
That's our show for now. If you want to learn more about the people you saw, you can log on to our website at tv.cuny.edu. I'm Ernabel Demillo. We'll see you next time on Shades of Us.